Welcome back, everyone. In this Unit 2 video, we're going to discuss the major types of macromolecules, beginning with carbohydrates. But before we begin, let's remember what we learned in our last video. All right, dehydration versus hydrolysis reactions. We're going to use these two types of reactions moving forward to either build or break down any particular macromolecule or polymer that we discuss. Again, dehydration here, you see, all right, we'll be taking two monomer units, pulling out a water molecule in order to create a bond, and now we've made a polymer. Small polymer, but we still made one. Or if I want to break it down, I'm now going to need to break that bond, this time by inputting water into it to break it, stabilize the two ends, and I have the individual monomer units that I can use to do anything my body needs them for. Alright, so again, no matter what type of macromolecule we discuss, these two reactions will still take hold. Alright, so moving on, let's begin discussion of organic molecules, in particular of carbohydrates. Alright, carbohydrates are also known as sugars, starches, fiber, grains, or roughage. So you can see over here, alright, all the things that we love. We have fruits, alright, we have all types of things here that are grain-based, breads, pastas, noodles, etc. Who doesn't love French fries of any degree? Most people think McDonald's are the best. I disagree. Chick-fil-A, waffle fries are where it's at these days, that's for sure. Alright, roughage would be like leafy greens, spinach, kale, salad, those types of things. They still have carbohydrates or sugars in them. Now, jobs and functions. Carbs have lots of jobs, but their main one is to provide the cell and or you with a quick burst of energy. So all carbohydrates, no matter what types they are, starches, fiber, grains, they are storing energy between the bonds that link all those monomer units together. And when you break those bonds, you are releasing that energy to drive all the processes in your body. Carbohydrates will be made up of just three elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Easy way to remember it is just go, your CHO. Never going to forget that, right? CHO, CHO. In a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. How ridiculous does that sound, right? But you can't forget it. So every single carbohydrate will always have a 1 carbon to 2 hydrogen to 1 oxygen ratio. All right, so it could be 100 carbons to 200 hydrogens to 100 oxygens. Reduce it, and you'll always get a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. You will never, ever, ever see any other elements present in a carb. It'll just be your CHO. So remember that. Now, those elements, your CHO, are going to make up some building blocks. All right, and then these are what we're going to use to build any larger type of carbohydrate moving forward. So the building blocks ultimately of any larger carbohydrate are going to be what we call monosaccharides, or simple sugars is another word. Mono means one. So we're looking at one individual ring or sugar molecule / monomer unit. That's the key. Before we proceed further down and you look at any of these diagrams below, these are all examples of monosaccharides. And for carbohydrate monomers, they're always going to be some type of ring shape. And we saw that in our gizmo lab that we were working on the other day here. So every single type of monosaccharide is going to be some sort of ring shape. Now, there's 3 examples I want you to remember, and they are glucose, fructose, and galactose. All right, all 3 of them are isomers of each other based on the formula of C6H12O6. All right, so when you look down here at these diagrams, all 3 of them are C6H12O6. Again, a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, but notice how all of the bonds are in different locations for each in particular monosaccharide sugar. All right, glucose, we know what that is, we've heard of, made in photosynthesis. Fructose is a fruit-based sugar. Galactose comes from dairy products, right, is really what the key is for there. So all 3 of these would be examples of, again, monosaccharides at this point, and they are all going to have a slightly different structure, and they're all going to have the same formula, C6H12O6. Now for disaccharides, all right, di means 2. All right, so now we're moving up and we're building. Disaccharides aren't necessarily considered the building blocks. Those would be monosaccharides, but they're still made of monosaccharides, two of them in particular that have been connected by a dehydration synthesis reaction. And there's going to be several examples of disaccharides I want you to remember too. So the first one's going to be sucrose, which if you don't know the name, you consume it every single day. And this is regular table sugar, the same stuff that you would put in, coffee, tea, Kool-Aid, if you're making some type of drink mix. Sucrose is a combination of both glucose and fructose together. All right, if you were to try some glucose by itself, it would be like a stale, kind of funky sugar taste. Fructose would be too sweet. Link them together, and it's just right. All right, it's perfect then at that point because that's how your body interprets it, as a nice even sugar. Another example would be maltose. All right, maltose is in fruit sugar as well, and it's made up of two glucose molecules combined. All right, obviously the sugar in any type of fruit you've consumed tastes a little bit different than regular table sugar, sucrose. So maltose will be glucose and another glucose linked together. And the third example I would like you to remember for disaccharides is lactose, all right, which comes in milk sugar or any other type of dairy product is what you're going to find lactose in. And lactose is a combination of the two monosaccharides, glucose and galactose. Now, as far as I would like you to remember for these three disaccharides, I do want you to remember what they are made of. So I do want you to recall that glucose and fructose make up sucrose, glucose and glucose, so two of them will make maltose, and then glucose, and a big hint here, galactose, you can see the lactose in there, are going to make up lactose. Visually speaking, how they would look, you do not have to memorize these structures, but you do have to recognize that they would be disaccharides because we have two monosaccharides linked together. I would have pulled out one water molecule to link them. So again, with sucrose, a glucose molecule, this should look hopefully a little bit familiar from building it or trying to build it during our Gizmos lab. Combined with fructose, your body would interpret that again as a nice even sweetness from regular table sugar. Again, lactose, connect glucose and galactose together. All right, even for the monosaccharides, I won't ask you to specifically know the difference visually, but I would ask you to recognize at least a simple sugar or one single monosaccharide. And then maltose, again, connect two glucoses together, and that's going to give that nice kind of like tart, even sweetness from fruit that we eat. And if we move on, the third and final type of carbohydrates is called a polysaccharide. Poly is going to mean three or more monosaccharides combined together via one of the dehydration synthesis reactions we've talked about. Actually, in fact, numerous ones. So these are what we would also call complex carbohydrates. So if you ever hear the phrase complex carbohydrates or you read that on the back of a nutritional label, it's referring to polysaccharides. Much larger, much more branched and expanded molecules, as you'll see in a moment. The examples that I would like you to remember for these are starch. Starch is the main type of plant food storage. All right, plants will store all their energy from photosynthesis. So as they make glucose, they just connect the glucose molecules together to form a gigantic molecule called starch. Plants don't store energy long-term like we do in the form of fat. All right, they store it as starch. So a potato, any type of tuber that you would consume, yams, potatoes, you name it, that is all starch stored 100% in the roots of that plant. When you bite into an apple, right, and you see the yellowy material inside, that's starch. That is stored energy as well. Plant is not necessarily trying to use it for itself. It's actually providing that starch as an attractant for animals to consume. When they consume the apple or the orange or the banana or whatever it is that they're going to eat, the seeds inside will not be digested by the animal. And when the animal walks somewhere else and eventually goes number 2, they're going to release those seeds with a bunch of nutrients and moisture, and the seeds will then be able to germinate and grow at that point. Next example would be called cellulose. This is made up, this makes up cell walls in any type of plant, as well as sometimes bacteria. All right, but we're going to focus on the plants right now. Cellulose is not digestible. It is so interlocked and woven in its structure that our saliva in our mouths or even our stomach acids are not able to break it down. So if you consume it, you will simply pass it at some point later on when you go to the bathroom. An example would be celery. All right, some of you probably love celery. If you eat celery, eventually after a while, you can start to feel this stringy material, almost like these threads that are starting to build up in your mouth as you chew. That is literally the cellulose that was making up the celery. That makes celery so tough. I mean, you can bend celery, all of a sudden it just breaks in half because it's so stiff. That's because of the actual cellulose. Then we have glycogen, which is how animals, such as you and I, will store energy short term. Mainly this glycogen is stored in your liver. If you don't use it after a certain amount of time, it'll be converted into fat, which is our long-term energy storage. And the last example is chitin, what it's called. This makes up the exoskeleton or arthropods, so lobsters and insects. All right, highly woven carbohydrate mixture with a little bit of what we call amino groups, which are going to be familiar to you once we get to our protein unit. So the idea again is you have monosaccharides up here. You could connect them to form disaccharides. All right, here's sucrose and lactose. Or as you start to link them together into a long chain and add more chains to the main chain, you get this highly branched complex molecule. This happens to be glycogen. Glycogen is the most branched out of all the polysaccharides I just mentioned, that you could see the giganticness of this molecule compared to any of the others. Again, if we look, starch that we would find again in plants for long-term energy stores like the potato here really is just a long single chain that may kind of take on this single helix shape at times, but it's not very branched. Glycogen you're mainly storing in your liver, and if you have low blood sugar, what your liver will do is it'll start to break off some of the little glucose molecules that are on this gigantic branched molecule and release the glucose into your blood, so your blood sugar will increase a little bit. But again, much more highly branched and spread out than you would find starch. Cellulose, again, making up plant cell walls. All right, also bacterial cell walls, but we'll get to that. Almost like threads that are all interconnected together, long single strands of carbohydrates. And what you can't see is there would be little hydrogen bonds between the two strands, linking them together, as well as the occasional oxygen bridge, making this a very, very tough layered molecule. All right, which is why the plants use it for strength. And then chitin over here, again, making up when you crush a bug or a tick. I mean, ever try to kill a tick? It's very hard. You literally have to smash them to pieces or burn them to actually be able to break them down. Very similar to cellulose. However, there are some differences that we don't have to get into. As I mentioned earlier, they'll have things like amino groups, which are pretty much nitrogen and a couple of hydrogens attached to each end. And those amino groups, I'm not sure if you can see it in my picture, these are kind of like little clear white bulbs where my laser pointer is. They will produce also hydrogen bonding between the strands. But you will only find this in arthropods. So, in conclusion, we have monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides as examples of carbohydrates. Again, the monosaccharides are going to literally be the building blocks of all the larger saccharides. Our examples of monosaccharides were glucose, fructose, and galactose. Disaccharides, when you combine two simple sugars together, our examples were sucrose, maltose, and lactose. Again, sucrose was glucose and fructose added together. Maltose was two glucoses. Lactose was glucose and galactose combined. And then the larger complex carbohydrates we call polysaccharides, three or more simple sugars together. And our examples were starch, cellulose, glycogen, and chitin. Starch, long-term energy storage in plants. Cellulose makes up their cell walls to provide strength. Glycogen is how we store glucose or sugar short-term in our livers, in that highly branched macromolecule. And then chitin is helping to give strength to the exoskeleton of arthropods. All right, thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, please make sure that you ask during our live session.